Hi, I'm Andy Cummings with AWS Training and Certification. Welcome to an introduction to autoscaling. I've been with AWS for going on a year and a half now, and I'm currently responsible for delivering live training events to AWS customers across North America. In this video, we will introduce autoscaling. We're going to go through an overview and potential use cases of the service, and then walk through a demonstration so you can see the service in action. So, what is autoscaling? Autoscaling helps you ensure that you have the correct number of EC2 instances available to handle the load for your application. Using autoscaling removes the guesswork of how many EC2 instances you need at a point in time to meet your workload requirements. When you run your applications on EC2 instances, it is critical to monitor the performance of your workload using CloudWatch. CloudWatch by itself, however, will not add or remove EC2 instances. This is where autoscaling comes into the picture. Let's look at an example workload. We've used CloudWatch to measure EC2 resource requirements over a standard week. Note that the resource requirements vary, with Wednesday requiring the most capacity and Saturday the least. We could go the route of allocating more than enough EC2 capacity to always be able to meet our highest demand time, in this case Wednesday. However, this means that we are running resources that will be underutilized most days of the week. This is an option, but our costs are not optimized. On the other end of the scale, we could allocate fewer EC2 instances, thus reducing cost. This means that we are under capacity on certain days, and if we don't solve our capacity problem, our application could underperform or potentially even time out for the user. Obviously, this is not a good thing. Autoscaling allows you to add or remove EC2 instances based on conditions that you specify. Autoscaling is especially powerful in environments with fluctuating performance requirements. This allows you to maintain performance and minimize cost. So autoscaling really answers two critical questions. One, how can I ensure that my workload has enough EC2 resources to meet fluctuating performance requirements? And two, how can I automate EC2 resource provisioning to occur on demand? Autoscaling matches up with two critical AWS best practices. Make your environment scalable and automate as much as possible. Let's take a closer look at the service. So what exactly do we mean by scaling? The first thing we have to do is define the concepts of scaling out and scaling in. Autoscaling can automatically adjust the number of EC2 instances running in your workload based on either conditions that you define, CPU utilization over 80% as an example, or a schedule. If autoscaling adds more instances, this is termed scaling out. When autoscaling terminates instances, this is scaling in. Remember that you have control as to what initiates these events. So how do you autoscale? There are three components required for autoscaling. First, you create a launch configuration. Second, you create an autoscaling group. And finally, you define at least one autoscaling policy. Let's take a closer look at what each of these components do. What is a launch configuration? Well, this is all about defining what will be launched by autoscaling. Think of all the things that you would specify when you launch an EC2 instance from the console, such as which Amazon machine image to use, what instance type, security groups, or roles to apply to the instance. What is an autoscaling group? This is about defining where a deployment takes place and some boundaries for the deployment. This is where you define which VPC to deploy instances and which load balancer to interact with. You also specify the boundaries for a group. If you set a minimum of 2, if your server count goes below 2, another instance will be launched to replace it. If you set the maximum to 8, you will never have more than 8 instances in your group. The desired capacity is the number that you wish to start with. What is an autoscaling policy? This is about specifying when to launch or terminate EC2 instances. You can schedule autoscaling every Thursday at 3 p.m. as an example, or create conditions that define thresholds to trigger adding or removing instances. Condition-based policies make your autoscaling dynamic and able to meet fluctuating requirements. It is best practice to create at least one autoscaling policy to specify when to scale out and at least one policy to specify when to scale in. How does dynamic autoscaling work? One common configuration is to create CloudWatch alarms based on performance information from your EC2 instances or a load balancer. When a performance threshold is breached, a CloudWatch alarm triggers an autoscaling event, which will either scale out or scale in EC2 instances in the environment. Let's take a look at a sample CloudWatch alarm. The first part of the alarm is a condition with a specific threshold. In this case, CPU utilization is greater than 80%. Note there is also a time period specified that you can control. This means we could be specifying that the alarm will fire if CPU utilization is over 80% for 5 consecutive minutes. The time period is critical because you don't want auto-scaling to trigger new instances because your processor spiked for 30 seconds. The second part of the alarm is the action to perform after the alarm is triggered. With auto-scaling, the action could be to add or remove instances. So in our case here, if the CPU is over 80% for one consecutive period, 5 minutes by default, auto-scaling will add 2 new instances to the auto-scaling group. As we add more instances, the CPU utilization should go down. We should set another CloudWatch alarm to define a threshold as to when instances should be terminated from the auto-scaling group. As an example, if CPU utilization goes below 20% for more than 5 consecutive minutes, terminate one instance. The beauty of all this is that auto-scaling can manage your workload dynamically so you can focus on other issues. Okay, let's do a brief demo with auto-scaling so you can see this for yourself. We're going to create a basic launch configuration, an auto-scaling group, and an auto-scaling policy. Then we'll finish up by triggering auto-scaling so we can see it work. So the first thing we're going to do is open up the EC2 service. Remember the 3 components we need to build out: a launch configuration, an auto-scaling group, and 1 or more auto-scaling policies. On the left-hand pane, we're going to scroll down to the auto-scaling section and choose auto-scaling groups. We'll click on Create Auto-Scaling Group. Then we'll select to create a launch configuration. If you've launched an EC2 instance before, you will recognize the choices we need to make. We're going to choose an Amazon AMI, and then we'll go ahead and choose an M4 large instance type. All right, now we'll give our launch configuration a name. We'll say Linux M4. We'll leave the default settings for storage and security groups. And we'll review our configuration and click Launch, Create Launch Configuration. Now we're going to choose an existing key pair that's already out there and create the launch configuration. All right, this takes us directly into the properties for the auto-scaling group. We'll give it a name. We'll say Sales App. You can see that it's using the launch configuration that we just built out. We're going to specify to start with 2 instances. And then we're going to specify which VPC and subnet to actually go to deploy the instances into. Then we're going to configure scaling policies. All right, we're going to choose to use scaling policies to adjust the capacity of this group. And we're going to set the scaling between 2 and 8 instances. This is going to be our minimum and maximum values here. We'll also use a simple target tracking policy that allows us to set a target value for a metric. We're going to go and say average CPU utilization of 60% here. A target tracking policy then automatically launches or terminates instances to meet your target value. We can still create individual policies for scaling in and out, but target tracking is the simplest way to get started with auto-scaling policies. We'll view where we can add notifications and tags, and then review and select to create the auto-scaling group. Okay, so now let's go ahead and view our auto-scaling group. Move this up a little tighter so we can see everything along the way. You can see that the minimum instance is set for 2 and the maximum is set for 8. And if we go to the Instances tab, we can see that there are 2 instances that are currently pending. These are brand new instances, and the reason those exist, this didn't exist before. Remember, we set the minimum value as to 2, so auto-scaling automatically launched 2 instances inside of here. Now to trigger auto-scaling immediately, we're going to manually increase the minimum group size. We'll click on the Details tab, choose to edit the details, and we're going to change the minimum number of instances and the desired configuration, so we're going to go up to 4. All right, so now our minimum number of instances should be 4 rather than 2. So seeing as how we have 2 already, we should be seeing 2 more instances that are being launched. Let's go back to the Instances tab, take a look inside, And as you can see, we now have 2 more instances that have been fired up automatically based on our launch configuration. Okay, so let's summarize what we've learned. Autoscaling allows you to add or remove EC2 instances based on conditions that you specify. Autoscaling is especially powerful in environments with fluctuating performance requirements. This allows you to maintain performance and minimize cost. Best of all, this process can scale in or scale out EC2 instances in the middle of the night while you are sleeping. The 3 core components we need are a launch configuration, the what to deploy, an autoscaling group, the where to deploy, and an autoscaling policy, which is the when to deploy.